What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I've been thinking about Avengers Kang Dynasty and Avengers Secret Wars, and it got my mind going in this direction of asking the question, are we going to see more variants, potential variants, of characters that we already know? So then I started thinking, if we did, what are like 10 versions of Iron Man that we could see in Avengers Secret Wars and Kang Dynasty, or Kang Dynasty and Secret Wars? So here's 10 variants that we could see, or that I want to see in this movie. But before we do that, we have to thank the sponsor of this video, Atlas VPN. So right now, Atlas VPN has this deal going on where you can get their service for like $1.83 a month. Like, that's a ridiculously good deal. And for those of you all who are not familiar with VPNs, this is called a virtual private network. What this means is that when you don't have a virtual private network and you get on your computer and you browse the internet, your actual IP address from your house can be seen. With a virtual private network, what you do is you make it look like you're actually somewhere else. Now, I use Atlas VPN for a couple different reasons. The first one is because of something called geo-restricting. For those of you guys who don't know what that means, when it comes to different streaming services out there, oftentimes what they do is they restrict content based on your geographic location. Now, in the States, it's not necessarily an issue insofar as like what you can see in California, you can see in Texas. But say, for example, that you were taking a trip to Spain and you wanted to stay caught up on your shows, you might not be able to see those shows because you're in Spain. Whereas if you have a VPN, you can basically get around that. Another reason why I use Atlas VPN, and in this day and age, I feel like this is an incredibly important thing, is because of their data breaching monitor feature. Basically meaning that what the software does is it continually scans the internet to see whether or not your personal information has basically been the subject or been a victim of a giant data breach that exists out there, which seems to happen more and more frequently. But based on those two things alone, I found Atlas VPN to be more than worth the $1.83 a month. So make sure you guys check out the link down in the description. Make sure you grab your copy of Atlas VPN, and let's get back into the video. And starting with the first one, we got to go with Iron Man from Earth X. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to Earth X, the story's less about Iron Man and more about like an entire universe, but it would be cool to see because for those of you guys who don't know, Earth X was a story that was written in 1999, and it actually is part of a 3-part series called Universe X and Paradise X. The other two I need to cover over Comics Explained. We did cover Earth X if you want to go check it out. But the general gist behind this is, for those of you guys who saw like Eternals, the nature in which Celestials are born in Eternals, that was started in Earth X. Eventually, Jonathan Hickman rolled that over into a S.H.I.E.L.D. miniseries, and that became the main way in which Celestials are born in the main Marvel Universe. But the idea behind that is there was essentially a Celestial that was going to be born in Earth, and that what it did is it led to a circumstance where initially the Inhumans wanted to conquer the Earth. And so when they left Attilan and they kind of spread throughout the rest of the world itself, that humanity started attacking Inhumans thinking they were mutants, and the Inhumans were being killed all over the place. Now, most of that's due to the fact that the Inhumans suck. And so what ended up happening is the Inhumans basically wanted to leave the Earth, but when they did, they were going to essentially set things up so that they could come back in a future point in time and essentially rule it. And so Black Bolt detonated the Terrigen bomb, spread Terrigenesis throughout the world, but when that happened, it basically ended up merging with all the toxins and stuff in the Earth's atmosphere, and it started activating mutant powers. And that's where you got mutants from in the Earth X universe. Now, this led to essentially everybody on Earth developing abilities by one way or another. For Tony Stark, he was one of the few who actually remained safe from it. And the way he did that was actually enclosing himself in what was essentially the Iron Mansion to a degree, but basically kept himself hidden away from the world. Eventually, Norman Osborn became president, and Tony Stark allied himself with Osborn, if for no other reason than to destroy him from basically the inside out, and then just kind of became a recluse, and then eventually sacrificed himself at the end of the story. Not a whole lot going there, but it would be pretty cool to see kind of an older, grizzled looking Iron Man. Obviously, we're starting from the least interesting, working our way to the most interesting. After that, of course, there is what's basically Thor core Iron Man, right? So this is, I guess, number 2 if we're going in order, whatever this order is, right? Thor core Iron Man is cool. Now, much like Earth X Iron Man, the main story itself is not so much about Iron Man, but it is a cool depiction of Iron Man. And the whole reason behind this is that in Secret Wars in 2015, that what Marvel did is they gave us the main Secret Wars story, but they also also gave us a whole bunch of tie-ins, and one of these was Thor Corps. Now, while the main Secret Wars story dealt with the idea of Doctor Doom becoming God King Doom and essentially ruling the entirety of Battleworld, because he didn't want to have to control everything going on all the time, that what he did is he created a police force. So essentially all these different territories, right, these different worlds on Battleworld itself, or these different land masses, whatever you want to call them, that they basically were allowed to appoint individuals who would actually travel to the citadel of the Thor Corps, and they would try to lift the hammer of a Thor, right, a single Mjolnir. And if they could do it, they would be inducted into the Thor Corps. If they weren't, they'd be sent back to their home. And so Iron Man was one of the individuals out there from one of these many places that was able to lift the hammer of Thor and became a member of the Thor Corps. Now, one of the things I want to specify is this was not a particular Iron Man of significance. It wasn't like it was Iron Man from the main Marvel Universe or the Ultimate Universe or anything like that. It was just a Iron Man that existed out there. But it was an alternate reality Iron Man who possessed the hammer of Thor. And so he literally looked like Iron Man with the Thor garb. And it looked really cool, right? We don't get a whole lot of him, but it looked really, really cool. So I would love to see a version, specifically this part of the Thor Corps, if the Thor Corps exists in that world. And they can make it work by whatever manner they want to. But the third one on our list here, and again, this is more about exploring universes than particular versions of Iron Man. We'll get into the really cool Iron Man here in a second. The Age of Apocalypse Iron Man. Now, a lot of people don't know about this story. It came out during the 1990s. The idea behind this is that you had a guy named David Haller, also known as Legion. And the whole gist behind this story is that Legion took it upon himself to go back in time and to basically kill Magneto, because Magneto had made life hell for his father, Charles Xavier. And the idea was that if he killed Magneto, it'd make it easy for Xavier with the X-Men and all that kind of stuff. Xavier jumps in the way, he dies, and because there are no X-Men, when the villain Apocalypse makes his move to conquer the world, that he basically starts conquering North America, setting his sights on the rest of the world. And so what you have is kind of a ragtag X-Men team, if you want to call it that. It's led by Magneto, but it's not really the X-Men as you know it, right? They're nowhere near as organized as the traditional X-Men that we know, and actually they're nowhere near as powerful. But one of the cool things about this is that humanity, at least those who managed to escape the United States before they fell under the tyrannical rule of Apocalypse, had gone to Europe. Iron Man was on a group called the Human High Council. So essentially he was one of the few humans that actually had a governing hand with regards to how they were going to handle North America. If I remember correctly, they were gonna nuke it. They were just gonna nuke North America and just be like, you know what? I'm sorry, Americans. It's time to go, and that was basically it. It would have been the end of America, which I feel like most of the world wants to do right now, but that would have basically been it, right? North America would have been nuked, and that would have been the end of it. I want to say they continued the Age of Apocalypse on in Secret Wars from 2015. I don't recall exactly how it happened, but the important thing here is that while it would give us a cool alternate reality version of Iron Man, it would actually give us a universe whereby mutants had essentially, or at least mutants had kind of banded together and under the rule of Apocalypse had conquered North America, because a lot of the characters, they're kind of change-ups. They're not really characters as you know them. Nightcrawler, for example, as opposed to being very religious and really kind of a bastion of hope among the X-Men, the guy's really dark. Juggernaut is a monk. Just all kinds of crazy stuff like that, right? Juggernaut was enormous in that story. And yeah, he was definitely a monk. But it would be cool to see that version of Iron Man there. Now, to get into the cool ones, to get into the cool versions of Iron Man that I know you guys all want to see. So the first one that I would want to see here is Armor Wars Iron Man from Secret Wars 2015. So here was the idea behind this. What you had was something called Technopolis. So in this alternate reality from Secret Wars 2015, that essentially you ended up learning that what Howard Stark had done is he had actually developed Stark Tech before Tony Stark did, right? So instead of Tony Stark being the one to develop the Iron Man suit, it was really Howard Stark who had done it. But what he had done is that in order to ensure the success of this suit he had designed, that he had created something called the Technopolis organic virus. And what it did is it was a virus that would actually infect a portion of humanity, which would require them to wear the suits of Howard Stark in order to survive. Nobody would know that's what happened. They would simply just know, oh my God, I'm sick, and only Howard Stark suits can save me. What ended up happening is the Technopolis organic virus ended up spreading throughout the world and basically basically infecting everybody. So everybody had to buy the suits of Howard Stark. Now, inevitably, people would figure out what was going on. And what ended up happening is that in order to ensure that didn't take place, Tony Stark had basically installed what were called inhibitor chips inside the different suits that were given to people, so that whenever it was they started to wonder where the techno-organic virus came from, it would basically make them forget. And then he basically scrapped all records of anybody knowing what was going on. Now, what ended up happening, of course, is like Spider-Man figured it out, and then Tony Stark killed Spider-Man in order to keep it covered up. It was a really, really cool thing, right? It was a really, really cool story. I won't ruin anything else for you guys, but it was a great concept. You're definitely welcome to check it out if you want to. I think we covered it over at Comics Explained, but that's a version of Iron Man that I want to see, right? Who comes from a world where everybody has to wear his suits. Otherwise, they're basically going to die. Now, following that, we get Infamous Iron Man. Now, Infamous Iron Man, I know a lot of you guys who read comics are just like, yes! Okay, Infamous Iron Man is technically not Tony Stark. Is actually Victor Von Doom. But the idea behind this is that in Marvel Comics, during the terrible garbage-ass event called Civil War II, which was a terrible cash grab by Marvel Comics where they screwed the pooch so bad, that's one of those stories that Marvel tries to sweep under the rug, but we're not gonna let them forget. So what ended up happening is that Tony Stark actually died at the end of that story. I think he was killed by Carol Danvers in what was some terrible attempt by Marvel Comics to like make things interesting for Carol. Honestly, she hadn't been cool since Kelly Sue DeConnick's run. But the thing about it is that with Tony Stark dead and out of the picture, that Victor Von Doom took up the mantle of Iron Man, and he was amazing. I would say Infamous Iron Man is probably the best Iron Man story that had been written since The Secret Origin of Tony Stark by Kieran Gillen, right? So like, well, actually, Christopher Cantwell's run is really, really good. I know this doesn't sound like a Geek Culture Explained video, kind of like a Comics Explained video, but we're talking about characters we could see in the Secret Wars movie, so we're making it work. It was a really, really, really cool run, right? Absolutely loved it. But Dr. Doom as Iron Man, it was actually kind of his redemption story in a lot of ways, right? Where Dr. Octopus got his redemption story when he took over the body of Peter Parker and ended up becoming a good guy until they went back to being a bad guy again, that Dr. Doom took over the mantle of Iron Man from Tony Stark. Oddly enough, it's one of those few instances where a character took over the role of another character, took the name, and nobody complained. I don't know. Search me. But it's one of those things where it was a great storytelling, phenomenal storytelling, and I absolutely loved it. Right, so a perfect example of selective outrage from comic book fans. But moving on from that, we get into what's basically the really like Emperor Iron Man. Now, Emperor Iron Man, if you haven't heard of him, really it's more Emperor Stark is what he's called. This is from an old comic called The Exiles. So way back in the day in Marvel Comics, in order to keep things interesting regarding the multiverse, what they did is they launched a story called The Exiles. Fascinating concept, right? Probably one of the coolest comic book runs that Marvel Comics ever had. That basically the Exiles were a multiversal team of mutants that really just kind of shifted around in terms of the roster and all that kind of stuff. But literally there was a story after the events of House of M. This was not part of it, this was before that, but it was a story from after the events of House of M called World Tour, where they went around to like a World War Hulk universe. So like, what if World War Hulk never ended? Different things like that, traveled to like these different alternate realities. Actually, no, it wasn't World War Hulk, it was the Future Imperfect universe, where where Maestro Hulk, the future version of Banner that went crazy after a global war, ended up creating like dystopia and all that kind of stuff. But they went to like the Marvel 2099 universe. It was a really, really cool run. But in issues number 23 through 25, what you got was this alternate reality where essentially it was the most dick version of Iron Man ever, right? Just like the most dick version ever. So what this guy had done, right? Think like V for Vendetta with this whole thing, with the way the Norse Fire Party came to power. What Tony Stark had done in this alternate reality is he had orchestrated the downfall of society by instigating the mutant war. He had worked directly alongside Magneto to essentially kind of initiate a war between the mutant population and the human population. And the idea behind this is that once the war was over, that a huge portion of the mutant population would be annihilated, right? But what it would do is it would allow for Magneto to rule everything, and then for Iron Man to operate as a kind of a grand regent for Magneto over a section of humanity. Instead, Iron Man betrayed Magneto and killed him, but it was recorded. And so because humanity saw this whole thing happening live, and because they knew that Magneto had led the mutant war against humanity, they saw Iron Man as a hero who single-handedly ended the mutant war. Now, following that, he was basically elected to president of the United States, but then set his sights on world domination. So what he started doing is he basically unleashed this virus that destroyed all kinds of crops and animal life across the world, right? This is so cool, right? It destroyed crops and animal life across the world, right? But then suddenly the entirety of Stark Industries popped up with like a cure. And while that was going on, then you basically had him using systems, right? Organizational structures, or really kind of like satellites and whatnot, that were basically creating natural disasters across the world. And only Stark Industries had the ability to end these natural disasters. So it was a really, really crazy situation. He basically kind of put himself in a position to where being this person that owned all these different companies and then using those companies to initiate economic collapses across the world, that it was like Stark Industries was like the one person that could save everybody. And in times of desperation, people will believe what they want to believe. Just look at Twitter in 2022. So what that meant is that people were desperate for an answer and they looked to Stark Industries to save them and never really asked any questions. And as a result of that, Tony Stark successfully makes himself the hero, like the leader of the world. Now, for anybody who opposed him, he killed them, right? X-Men, Avengers, it didn't matter. Any superheroes who stood against them, he annihilated them. And the only ones left were the Inhumans. He probably kept them alive because he felt bad for them because the Inhumans suck, right? So it's like, you know what? Let's let those guys live. They suck. They're not really that powerful. It's not like they can do anything anyway. So like, that was basically it. Now, following that, we got kind of a sort of one-off. We didn't get it very long, but we basically got the Sorcerer Supreme Iron Man, which was really, really cool, right? Now, this is a version of Stephen Strange. It was actually from a What If story. It's Earth 9810. It was a story where Doctor Strange, or Stephen Strange, had basically had the whole accident that cost him the use of his hands, but Tony Stark was with him. And so Tony Stark, who was actually driving at the time, ended up promising Doctor Strange that they would find a way to fix his hands, and that they ended up traveling to Tibet, and it was Tony Stark who encountered the Ancient One, and that Tony Stark ended up defeating Baron Mordo, and that he earned the title of Sorcerer Supreme. So think of the origin of Doctor Strange as you know it, except it was Tony Stark who became Sorcerer Supreme, and Stephen Strange was kind of a side-along guy, and that was basically it. But it'd be great to see a version of Tony Stark that became the Sorcerer Supreme. It'd be really, really cool, right? I'd be really excited. And it's kind of a bonus here because I think we've done 10, but I can't really remember off the top of my head. So as a bonus here, no, we're at 9 right now. The last one that I want to see, right? Number 10 here, the original Tony Stark, right? Like Robert Downey Jr. Tony Stark. I would love to see MCU Iron Man make a return. I think it'd be cool, right? If for no other reason than the fact that we get an alternate reality that unfolded pretty much the exact same way as the main Marvel Cinematic Universe has unfolded, except maybe some small difference. Some difference that's small enough that we can kind of say, it's basically the same universe, and like that's basically it, right? Just kind of call it a day. But we basically get Robert Downey Jr. returning as Iron Man in some capacity. I would love to see that happen. But for a bonus, number 11, for a bonus here, Tom Cruise's Superior Iron Man. I think we can all agree that's the guy we want to see next. I think there's so much hype and so much excitement. Does that mean Tom Cruise's Superior Iron Man is better than Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man? No, and you'd be a fool to believe otherwise. You walk up to anybody out there, right? It's feels, right? It's the feels, right? You walk up to anybody out there and you ask the question, you say, hey, who would you want to see more here, right? Like Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man return or Tom Cruise's Superior Iron Man, they're probably gonna say Robert Downey Jr. Iron Man, right? Just because, you know, we love nostalgia, so it's like we'd love to see him come back. I'd totally be down with that. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you guys check out Atlas VPN, and I will catch you all later. Peace.